On our anniversary, my husband threw away my handmade gift and said he wanted something real. Our daughter laughed and said, "You can't beat Dad's new wife." I didn't argue. I just picked it out of the trash. A few weeks later, he saw it on display, with a $170,000 price tag. "That's from Hazel. Dad's friend from work bought it for me because she felt bad about my clothes." My 16-year-old daughter Amelia stood in her bedroom doorway, wearing a designer jacket worth more than our monthly groceries, delivering this information like she was telling me about the weather. I set down the ceramic vase I'd been carrying, 3 months of secret pottery work, covered in hand-painted chrysanthemums for Dylan's anniversary gift tomorrow, and felt something crack inside me that had nothing to do with clay. Hazel. A woman's name I'd never heard before, buying my daughter expensive clothes, and Amelia saying it like I should already know who she was. My fingers, still stained cobalt blue from the glazing work, trembled as I reached for the jacket's price tag, still attached inside the collar. $800. For a jacket. From Dad's friend. She owns a gallery, Amelia continued, turning to examine herself in the hallway mirror. On 5th Avenue. She said she remembers what it's like being young and wanting to fit in. The way she said it, so matter-of-fact, made my chest tighten. I watched my daughter smooth down the Italian leather, watched her face light up in a way it never did when I brought home fabric to make her something special. Last month I'd spent 2 weeks sewing her a dress for the school dance, hand-embroidering tiny flowers along the hem. She'd worn it once, then hidden it in the back of her closet behind the clothes Dylan bought her. "How long has Dad been friends with this Hazel?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my mind was racing through every late night Dylan had worked, every weekend meeting, every time he'd come home smelling of perfume that wasn't mine. "I don't know. A while." Amelia shrugged, already losing interest in the conversation. "She's cool though. She knows about art and stuff. Real art. Real art." The words stung more than they should have. I glanced down at the vase in my hands, at the chrysanthemums I'd painted so carefully that my eyes would blur from the detail work. Each petal contained at least 12 different color gradations, a technique I'd developed myself after 6 failed attempts. The pottery teacher at the community center had called it revolutionary. But apparently it wasn't real art. I made my way to our tiny kitchen, setting the vase carefully on the counter where I'd been putting the final touches on the glaze. The morning light from our single good window caught the surface, making the flowers seem to breathe. Tomorrow was our anniversary. 12 years. I'd started working on this piece 3 months ago, sneaking off to the community studio whenever Dylan worked late, which was increasingly often. The apartment felt smaller than usual as I moved through our morning routine. Dylan emerged from the bedroom at exactly 7:15, his pattern as predictable as the subway schedule. Dark suit, blue tie, the same cologne he'd worn since law school. He scrolled through his phone while I made his coffee, 2 sugars, splash of cream in the mug his mother had given us as a wedding gift. "Don't wait up tonight," he said without looking up from his screen. Big case. The Henderson merger. I'd heard about the Henderson merger for 3 months now. It required a lot of late nights apparently. A lot of weekend meetings. A lot of times when he'd come home after midnight and slide into bed, careful not to touch me, reeking of wine and someone else's perfume. "Tomorrow's our anniversary," I said quietly, watching his face for any sign of recognition. His fingers paused on his phone for just a moment. "Right. We should do something. We should do something." 12 years of marriage reduced to an obligation, a checkbox on his calendar probably marked by his secretary. I wanted to tell him about the vase, about the months of work, about how I'd developed a new glazing technique just to capture the way morning light looked on chrysanthemums. Instead, I just nodded and poured his coffee. At the community center that afternoon, I tried to focus on teaching my pottery class to the group of seniors who came twice a week. My student Margaret, 73 years old with hands that shook unless she was working with clay, noticed the distraction immediately. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked, her eyes sharp despite her age. "You keep staring at nothing." I showed her a photo of the vase on my phone, needing someone to see it to confirm it existed, that it mattered. She studied the image for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "It's beautiful," she said finally. "The color work is extraordinary. What's the occasion?" "Anniversary gift. For my husband." Margaret's hands stilled on her clay. "My husband threw away everything I ever made for him. Said it was cluttering up the house. 20 years of needlework, pottery, paintings. All of it in the garbage. She looked up at me and her eyes held a warning. 6 months after he died, the Metropolitan Museum called. They'd seen one of my pieces at an estate sale, wanted to acquire my entire collection. $2 million they paid his second wife for work he'd called worthless. The room felt cold suddenly, despite the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. "I'm sorry," I said, not knowing what else to offer. "Don't be sorry. Be smart." She returned to her clay, her movements deliberate and precise. "That vase of yours, it's professional quality. Museum quality even. But if your husband is anything like mine was, he won't see it. Men like that, they only see value when someone else tells them it's there." That evening I sat alone at our small dining table, adding the final layer of sealant to the vase. The apartment was quiet except for the neighbor's television bleeding through the thin walls. Amelia was in her room, probably on the phone with friends, trying on that expensive jacket again. Dylan was at his meeting or with Hazel or wherever he went when he said he was working late. I thought about Margaret's words as I worked, about value and recognition, about the difference between what something was worth and what someone thought it was worth. The vase was perfect now, every line and curve exactly as I'd envisioned. Tomorrow I would give it to Dylan and maybe, just maybe, he would see what I'd poured into it. Maybe he would understand that this was more than just a gift. It was proof that I was more than just someone who made his coffee and kept his house and raised his daughter while he built his career. But even as I told myself this story, I knew better. The evidence was there in Amelia's $800 jacket, in Dylan's late nights, in the way he looked through me rather than at me. Tomorrow would be our anniversary and I would give him this vase that contained 3 months of my life, and he would set it aside the way he set aside everything I made, everything I was. The cobalt blue under my fingernails caught the light as I lifted the vase one final time, checking for imperfections that didn't exist. Tomorrow would be different, I told myself. Tomorrow had to be different. The morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. I woke early, my hands steady as I prepared everything for tonight's dinner. The vase sat on the counter, finally complete, its chrysanthemums catching the pale morning light in a way that made my breath catch. 12 years deserved something special, something that showed I still believed in us despite the growing distance, despite the late nights, despite Hazel's name hanging unspoken in the air between us. By 5 o'clock, I had transformed our cramped dining area into something almost magical. The dollar store candles looked elegant in the dimness, their flames reflecting off the good plates I'd saved from my mother's estate. The chicken marsala filled the apartment with the scent of wine and mushrooms, though I'd burned my wrist twice on our temperamental oven that ran 50 degrees hotter than the dial claimed. The mark would blister, but I didn't care. I wrapped the vase in tissue paper I'd spent an hour hand-painting with tiny gold hearts, each one a small declaration of hope. 6 o'clock passed. Then 6:30. I texted Dylan once, a simple reminder about dinner. The message showed as read, but no response came. The marsala began to congeal in its pan. The candles dripped wax onto the tablecloth. At 6:40 I heard his key in the lock. Dylan entered looking like he'd been somewhere that required close contact. His usually pristine suit was wrinkled, his tie askew, and the smell that preceded him into our home wasn't his cologne. It was something floral and expensive, something that clung to his jacket like an accusation. "Traffic was horrible," he said, not meeting my eyes as he surveyed the table with the expression of someone discovering an ambush. "You didn't have to do all this." The dismissal in his voice made my chest tighten, but I pushed forward, gesturing to his chair. "It's our anniversary. 12 years. He sat reluctantly, checking his phone twice before I even had the chance to serve the food. I watched him eat mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere, probably with whoever owned that perfume. When I placed the wrapped gift in front of him, he stared at it like it might explode. "Open it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His fingers worked at the paper without enthusiasm, tearing through the hearts I'd painted so carefully. When the vase emerged, when the candlelight hit those chrysanthemums and made them glow like they were alive, I held my breath waiting for his reaction. His face shifted from mild curiosity to something worse than anger. Disappointment mixed with embarrassment, the look you give a child who's presented you with a macaroni necklace when you're too old to pretend it's jewelry. "Stella." He set the vase down carefully, too carefully, like it might contaminate him. "We talked about this. About gifts. You said you wanted something real, I started, but he was already shaking his head. This isn't what I meant. He pulled out his phone, swiping to a photo. Look, this is what Hazel gave me. A Rolex Submariner. $18,000. That's a real gift. The room tilted. Hazel. He'd said her name like I should understand, like this was normal, like receiving $18,000 watches from another woman was something that happened in marriages. Who is Hazel? My voice sounded strange, disconnected from my body. Dylan looked at me with genuine surprise, as if I'd asked who the president was. I told you about her. My paralegal. He paused, scrolling through his phone again. Well, more than that now. We got married 6 months ago. Small ceremony at the courthouse. I'm sure I mentioned it. The words didn't make sense. They were English, arranged in a grammatical structure I understood, but their meaning refused to process. Married. 6 months ago. While we were still married, while I was sleeping beside him, while I was making his coffee every morning with 2 sugars and a splash of cream. We're married, I said stupidly. Technically yes. The divorce papers are delayed. Some filing error. He shrugged like we were discussing a parking ticket. But Hazel understands me, Stella. He gets what I need. She owns the Morrison Gallery on 5th Avenue. He appreciates success, ambition. She doesn't think a partnership is about homemade crafts and dinner at home. That's when Amelia walked in wearing the designer jacket, her timing so perfect it felt rehearsed. She glanced at the table, at the cooling food and dying candles, at the vase sitting abandoned by her father's plate, and she laughed. Not a nervous laugh or an uncomfortable one, but genuine amusement, the kind that bubbled up from real joy. Oh my God, Mom. You actually gave it to him. She picked up the vase, examining it like a curious artifact from an ancient civilization. This is so embarrassing. You can't compete with Dad's new wife. She owns an actual gallery. She knows what real art looks like. The betrayal from Dylan was expected somehow, a wound I'd been preparing for without admitting it. But Amelia's words, her casual cruelty, her easy dismissal of my work and my worth, that cut deeper than anything Dylan could have done. My daughter, who I'd taught to mix paint at age 3, who'd sat beside me at the pottery wheel just 2 years ago, had chosen her side without ever telling me there was a choice to make. When did you meet her? I asked Amelia, my voice surprisingly steady. Like months ago. She's been taking me shopping, helping me understand fashion and art and stuff that matters. She says I have potential, that I just need the right guidance. Amelia set the vase down with a careless thunk. She's teaching me about the real world, not this hobby stuff you do. Dylan stood abruptly, grabbing the vase with one hand like it was a piece of trash that needed immediate disposal. He walked to the kitchen and I heard the foot pedal of our garbage can, then the devastating thud of 3 months' work hitting the plastic liner. The sound echoed in the small apartment, final and absolute. I need something real in my life, Stella, he said, returning to grab his jacket. Hazel and I have a gallery opening tonight. Important collectors will be there. People who understand value. I'm going too, Amelia announced, already heading for the door. Hazel promised to introduce me to real artists. They left together, father and daughter, their footsteps synchronized in the hallway like they'd been practicing this exit. The apartment door closed with a decisive click, leaving me alone with the remnants of an anniversary dinner no one wanted. The candles continued their futile flickering, wax pooling on the tablecloth I'd inherited from my grandmother. The food sat untouched, growing cold like the marriage I'd been trying to save. I stood frozen in our kitchen, staring at the garbage can that held my gift. Through the thin walls, I could hear our neighbor's television playing a game show where people won money for answering questions correctly. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been answering the wrong questions for 12 years, trying to solve a puzzle that had already been completed without me. The apartment felt larger, suddenly emptier, like Dylan and Amelia had taken something essential with them when they left. Not love, that had departed long ago. They'd taken my delusions, my careful pretense that we were still a family, that my efforts mattered, that handmade gifts could compete with Rolex watches and gallery connections. I remained standing there, still in the dress I'd chosen carefully for tonight, still wearing the lipstick Dylan hadn't noticed, still believing somewhere deep down that tomorrow might be different. The candles finally guttered out, leaving me in darkness punctuated only by the city lights filtering through our single good window. Somewhere across town, my husband and daughter were entering a gallery with his new wife, surrounded by real art, leaving me here with the trash. The silence in the apartment pressed against my eardrums like water pressure at depth. I stood there for another 10 minutes, maybe 15, unable to move or think beyond the sound of that thud echoing in my mind. Finally, something primitive kicked in. Not quite rage, not quite determination, but a survival instinct that propelled me toward the kitchen sink. The yellow latex gloves from under the sink felt like armor as I snapped them on. I approached the trash can with the careful reverence of an archaeologist approaching a dig site. Inside, my vase sat atop coffee grounds and yesterday's takeout containers, a streak of orange Thai sauce painting one side like a wound. My hands shook as I lifted it out, cradling it against my chest despite the debris clinging to its surface. At the sink, I worked with the patience of a conservator restoring a masterpiece. Each paper towel dabbed away the indignity of garbage, revealing the chrysanthemums beneath still vibrant, still perfect, still defiant. As I cleaned, my grandmother's voice surfaced from somewhere deep in memory. She'd been standing at her own kitchen sink, washing dishes after another family dinner where my grandfather had dismissed her painting as a waste of time. "The world only sees what you show them, dear," she'd said, her Hungarian accent thick with conviction. "Show them garbage, they'll treat you like garbage. Show them gold and watch them scramble." I wrapped the vase in bubble wrap from the moving supplies we'd never thrown away, each layer of protection feeling like a small act of rebellion. Then I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. The screen's glow, the only light in the apartment besides the city bleeding through our window. Eleanor Morrison's name appeared in article after article. The 70-year-old gallery owner had discovered at least a dozen artists who'd gone from unknown to selling pieces for 6 figures. Every interview contained the same themes: authenticity over pedigree, emotion over technique, story over surface. In a Times piece from last year she'd said, "The best art comes from genuine pain transformed into beauty." I can spot inauthentic work from across the room, but true emotional resonance? That stops me in my tracks. I read until my eyes burned, until the city quieted to its 3 a.m. whisper, until I knew every exhibition she'd curated, every artist she'd launched, every quote she'd given about finding truth in unexpected places. By the time birds started their pre-dawn chorus, I'd memorized her gallery hours, her assistant's name, even the coffee shop next door where she reportedly spent mornings reviewing submissions. Sleep felt impossible, so I stood in front of the bathroom mirror practicing my pitch. The woman staring back looked like a ghost of myself, hollow-eyed, pale, hair limp from the night's humidity. But something in those eyes had changed. The deadness I'd grown accustomed to seeing had been replaced by something sharper, hungrier. "Mrs. Morrison," I practiced, my voice hoarse from disuse. "My name is Stella Brennan. I have a piece that was literally thrown in the trash by someone who couldn't recognize its value. But I think you might see what he couldn't. Too desperate. Too bitter. Mrs. Morrison, I'm an artist whose work explores themes of dismissal and worth. Too pretentious. Mrs. Morrison, my husband threw this in the garbage because it wasn't real enough. I'd like to know what you think. Direct. Honest. The kind of story that might intrigue someone who'd built a career on finding overlooked talent." At 8 a.m. I called the library where I worked part-time, my voice carefully constructed to sound congested. My supervisor, Janet, barely listened to my excuse before granting the sick day. After 3 years of perfect attendance, I'd earned the benefit of doubt. The lie came easily, surprisingly so for someone who'd spent 12 years telling the truth to someone who'd been lying the entire time. The subway ride to the Upper East Side felt like crossing into another country. My fellow passengers transformed from tired workers in sensible shoes to women in designer workout clothes heading to boutique fitness studios. By the time I emerged at 77th Street, my worn coat felt like a neon sign advertising my displacement. Morrison Gallery occupied a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows that turned art viewing into performance. Even from across the street I could see the current display, massive abstract paintings that seemed to vibrate with color and movement. The security guard at the entrance wore a suit nicer than anything in Dylan's closet. His eyes tracked me from the moment I approached, taking in my coat with its pilled fabric, my scuffed boots, my tote bag that had seen better decades. I walked past him without acknowledging his stare, my chin lifted in a way that suggested I belonged here, that my presence was intentional rather than desperate. The gallery's interior hummed with that particular quiet of expensive spaces, climate-controlled air, subtle classical music, the soft footfalls of the few early visitors already examining pieces. Eleanor Morrison stood near a bronze sculpture in the center of the room, her silver hair pulled back in a chignon that looked effortlessly elegant. She wore all black, turtleneck, slacks, architectural jewelry that could have been art itself. Her fingers traced the sculpture's curves while she spoke quietly into her phone, something about shipping logistics and insurance valuations. I waited, clutching my tote bag with the vase inside, now wrapped in my best scarf because the bubble wrap had seemed too cheap, too obviously desperate for this space. The scarf had been my mother's, silk with a pattern of birds that she'd bought on her honeymoon in Paris. It felt right somehow, protecting one piece of dismissed beauty with another. Eleanor ended her call and turned, her eyes landing on me with the kind of assessment that felt like being X-rayed. She took in my coat, my bag, my stance, and something in her expression shifted. Not pity, not dismissal, but curiosity. "Can I help you?" Her voice carried authority softened by genuine interest. The pitch I'd practiced dissolved. Instead, truth tumbled out raw and unvarnished. "My name is Stella Brennan. Last night, my husband threw my anniversary gift in the trash because it wasn't real enough for him. He's married to someone else now, someone who owns a gallery and apparently knows what real art looks like. But I think what I made might actually be something. And I remembered you speaking at the ceramic symposium last year about finding authenticity in unexpected places." Eleanor's eyebrow lifted slightly. "You were there. Third row. Blue notebook. You talked about how the best art comes from genuine emotion, not manufactured sentiment." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Show me." My hands trembled as I unwrapped the scarf, revealing the vase to the gallery's perfect lighting. The chrysanthemums seemed to come alive, each petal catching and reflecting light in ways that made them appear to breathe. Eleanor circled the piece twice, her fingers hovering just above the surface, never quite touching. The silence stretched so long I became aware of my own heartbeat, of the climate-controlled air moving through my lungs, of the weight of everything resting on this moment. Finally, she pulled out her phone, never taking her eyes off the vase. "Marcus, clear the Fifth Avenue window display. We have something special." My legs gave out completely. The expensive leather chair in Eleanor's office caught me as I collapsed into it, the number she had just spoken reverberating through my skull like a bell struck too hard. $170,000. For something that had been sitting in my trash 12 hours ago. "I need you to understand what we're dealing with here," Eleanor said, settling behind her glass desk with the practiced grace of someone who had delivered life-changing news before. "This isn't just about the technical skill, though your glazing technique is genuinely revolutionary. The way you've layered the colors to create depth, how the chrysanthemums appear to be simultaneously blooming and withering, that's museum-quality work." My mouth opened but no words emerged. Museum quality. The same piece Dylan had dropped into our kitchen garbage without a second thought. Eleanor continued, her fingers steepled as she studied me. "But what makes this truly valuable is the story. A woman's artistic vision, literally discarded by a man who couldn't recognize mastery when he held it in his hands. The collectors who shop here, they don't just buy art. They buy meaning, narrative, vindication. Your vase is all three." She turned her computer screen toward me, showing a mock-up of the window display. The vase would sit alone on a white pedestal, dramatic spotlights creating shadows that made the chrysanthemums appear three-dimensional. Below it, a gold placard with text that made my breath catch. "Chrysanthemums for the blind. A study in dismissed brilliance. Opening bid, $170,000. We'll have it installed by tomorrow morning," Eleanor said, already typing something on her phone. "Marcus will handle the lighting. I'll personally write the piece's story for our catalog. Every major collector in the city will know about this by week's end." I signed papers in a daze, my signature looking foreign on documents that contained more zeros than I had ever seen associated with my name. Eleanor assigned me a liaison, a young woman named Catherine who would handle all communications and keep me updated on interest in the piece. She handed me a business card with the gallery's logo embossed in gold, my name already added as featured artist beneath it. The subway ride home felt surreal, like moving through a dream where familiar things had taken on strange new dimensions. I clutched the business card so tightly it left indentations in my palm. By the time I reached my stop, my phone had started its assault. The first notification came from my cousin in New Jersey, a Facebook message with 14 exclamation points. Is this your vase in the Morrison Gallery window? Attached was a photo clearly taken through the glass, the display even more magnificent than the mock-up had suggested. The lighting made my chrysanthemums glow like they contained their own fire. Within an hour my phone became unusable. High school acquaintances I had not spoken to in 15 years suddenly remembered we were best friends. Distant relatives emerged from social media dormancy to congratulate me on my success. My former pottery teacher, Mrs. Chin, sent a photo of herself standing in front of the display with tears streaming down her face, accompanied by a long message about how she had always known I was special, how she had seen my potential from day one. Interesting, considering she had spent 2 years telling me my technique was too unconventional, that I needed to follow established methods if I wanted to succeed. Then Dylan's name appeared on my screen. A text, then another in rapid succession. What kind of game are you playing? Stella, this is completely inappropriate. You need to take that down immediately. This affects my professional reputation. Answer your phone. 17 missed calls accumulated while I sat at my kitchen table eating cereal from the box, watching my phone light up like a crisis hotline. I screenshot every message, every missed call notification, creating a digital record of his panic. But I did not respond. Not a single word. Instead, I opened Instagram, where the situation had already exploded beyond my comprehension. Someone with 2 million followers had posted a photo of themselves in front of the gallery window with the caption, "This queen threw her art in the trash and now it's worth $170,000. Know your worth, ladies." The hashtags multiplied like cells dividing. Hashtag trash to treasure, hashtag know your worth, hashtag artistic justice, hashtag queen energy. The story had already morphed, details shifting with each retelling. Some posts claimed Dylan had burned my previous works. Others said he had laughed while throwing it away. One particularly creative account insisted he had tried to steal it back once he learned its value. The truth, that he had simply dismissed it as unimportant, seemed insufficient for the internet's hunger for drama. My phone rang again, but this time it was my mother calling from Florida. I stared at her contact photo, taken 3 Christmases ago when we had all pretended to be a happy family, before answering. "Stella, honey, I'm looking at a photo of your vase on Facebook. Is this real? Is that really your piece?" Her voice carried a mixture of pride and hurt that made my chest tighten. "It's real, Mom. Why didn't you tell me about any of this? The problems with Dylan, your art being in a gallery. I had to find out from Cousin Rita's Facebook post." The accusation in her voice was justified. I had spent 2 years making excuses for missing family gatherings, claiming work conflicts when really I could not bear to pretend everything was fine while Dylan grew more distant and Amelia grew more contemptuous. "I didn't know how to explain it," I said quietly. "How do you tell your mother that your husband has been married to someone else for 6 months? That your own daughter thinks you're an embarrassment?" The silence stretched across the miles between us. Finally she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "You tell her the truth. You let her help. You don't carry it alone. Sometimes you don't know you're drowning until someone throws you a life preserver," I said, the words coming out more philosophical than intended. Another long pause. I could hear her breathing, could picture her in her sunny Florida kitchen with the yellow walls she had painted herself, surrounded by her own art that Dad had always called her little projects. "I'm booking a flight," she said finally. "For the auction. Whatever happens, you won't be alone for it." After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my apartment, phone still lighting up with notifications I no longer bothered to read. 3 days ago I had been invisible, my work deemed literal garbage by the person who was supposed to value it most. Now strangers were calling me queen, sharing my story like it was their own victory, turning my humiliation into their inspiration. The transformation felt too quick, too surreal, like emotional whiplash that left me dizzy and disoriented. My vase sat in a window on 5th Avenue, worth more than Dylan made in a year, and I sat alone eating dry cereal in an apartment that still smelled faintly of the anniversary dinner no one had wanted. The cereal box sat empty on my counter when the sharp knock came Thursday evening. Through the peephole I saw Dylan's face, flushed and angry, with a woman behind him who could only be Hazel. She stood like someone who had never doubted her place in the world, her architectural glasses reflecting the harsh hallway fluorescence, her black dress so perfectly minimalist it probably cost more than my monthly rent. I opened the door slowly, deliberately, letting them wait an extra second before meeting Dylan's eyes. He pushed past me without invitation, the gesture so familiar it almost made me laugh. 12 years of marriage and he still moved through space like he owned it. "You need to stop this," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Whatever game you're playing, it ends now." Hazel followed him in, her heels clicking against my worn hardwood floors with surgical precision. She surveyed my apartment with the kind of quick assessment that cataloged and dismissed everything in seconds. The mismatched furniture. The water stain on the ceiling. The stack of library books on my coffee table. I watched her file it all away as evidence of my insignificance. "Mrs. Brennan," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that could rot teeth. "I'm Hazel Morrison. I believe there's been a misunderstanding about your craft project." Craft project. The words hung in the air between us, calculated to diminish, to put me back in what she considered my place. This woman who had stolen my husband, who had bought my daughter's affection with designer clothes, who owned a gallery but somehow could not recognize actual artistry when her new husband threw it in the garbage. "There's no misunderstanding," I said, remaining by the door, refusing to move deeper into my own home. "The piece is in Eleanor Morrison's gallery. The bid starts at $170,000. 3 collectors have already submitted sealed bids above that amount." Dylan's jaw clenched. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to Hazel's reputation? People are calling her gallery, asking if she's the woman who married the man too stupid to recognize valuable art. They're questioning her judgment, her eye for talent." The irony was so thick I could have served it for dinner. I pulled out my phone, swiping to the email that had arrived that morning. "Speaking of reputations," I said, holding the screen toward them, "the Guggenheim would like to feature my vase in their upcoming exhibition on overlooked female artists. They're calling it a defining piece of contemporary ceramic art." Hazel's face went pale beneath her perfect foundation. She reached for the phone, but I pulled it back, not willing to let her touch even that small part of my new reality. Her composure cracked slightly, revealing something desperate underneath. "That piece isn't worth that kind of money," she insisted, her voice losing its honeyed coating. "This is clearly a spite-fueled publicity stunt. You're embarrassing yourself." The accusation might have stung if it had come from someone whose opinion mattered, from someone who had not participated in dismantling my life piece by piece. But from Hazel, standing in my apartment wearing my husband like an accessory, the words were meaningless noise. "Embarrassing myself?" I repeated, letting the absurdity of the statement hang in the air. "I'm not the one who failed to recognize a $170,000 piece of art while claiming to be a gallery owner. I'm not the one who convinced a married man to abandon his family for someone who can't tell the difference between trash and treasure." That's when I noticed movement in the hallway. Amelia stood just outside the door, hovering at the threshold like she was afraid to fully enter. She looked smaller somehow, uncertain in a way I had not seen since she was much younger. The designer jacket that had seemed so important days ago now appeared to weigh her down. "Mom." Her voice was quiet, almost lost. "Is it really worth that much?" For the first time in months, she looked like my daughter instead of Dylan's ally. The confidence she had worn like armor when she laughed at my gift had evaporated, replaced by something that might have been regret. "The current highest sealed bid is $210,000, I said, keeping my voice steady, factual. "The auction is Tuesday." Amelia's eyes widened, darting between Dylan and me like she was seeing us both for the first time. The math was simple enough for a 16-year-old to understand. Her father had thrown away more money than most people see in a lifetime. He had declared worthless something that experts were fighting to own. Dylan noticed her presence and his tactics shifted immediately. "This is what I'm talking about, Stella. You're humiliating our daughter. Her friends at school are all talking about this. You're affecting her life with this vindictive display." The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. Using Amelia as a shield, weaponizing parental concern when he had taken her to celebrate with his new wife the night he threw away my gift. "I'm succeeding publicly," I said, my voice clear and steady. "You humiliated yourself privately when you decided that something made with love had no value. I just gave the world a chance to disagree with your assessment." Hazel stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Be reasonable. This affects all of us. We could work out an arrangement, perhaps feature some of your work in my gallery, give you legitimate representation." The offer was so absurd I actually laughed. You want to represent me? After your husband threw my work in the trash? After you convinced my daughter that my art was worthless? I didn't. Amelia started, then stopped, her face crumpling slightly. I didn't know. Those 3 words carried more weight than any apology could have. She didn't know because she hadn't bothered to look. She had been so dazzled by Hazel's designer world, by the promise of expensive things and gallery connections, that she had forgotten who taught her to mix colors when she was 3 years old, who had shown her how to find beauty in ordinary things. The Rolex, I said suddenly, looking at Dylan's wrist where the watch gleamed under my apartment's cheap lighting. The $18,000 gift from your new wife. Is it even real? Hazel's face flushed, a tell so obvious it answered the question without words. Dylan's hand moved instinctively to cover the watch, his expression shifting from anger to uncertainty. That's irrelevant, he said, but his voice had lost its edge. Is it? I asked. You threw away authentic art for a fake watch. That seems entirely relevant. They left after that, their exit less dramatic than their entrance. Dylan muttered something about lawyers and damages, Hazel's heels clicked with less certainty, and Amelia lingered in the doorway for one long moment. Something in her eyes had changed, a recognition perhaps of what she had laughed at, what she had dismissed, what she had thrown away along with her father. After the door closed, I stood in my empty apartment, surrounded by the echoes of their visit, and felt something I had not experienced in years. Not quite peace but clarity. The kind that comes from standing your ground when everything in you wants to collapse. Tuesday morning arrived with unseasonable rain that turned Manhattan into a watercolor painting through my window. My mother sat at my kitchen table, having arrived from Florida the night before, her presence both comforting and strange in the apartment where I had hidden my failing marriage for so long. She held her coffee with both hands, studying me over the rim with eyes that saw too much. You look different, she said quietly. Stronger. I wanted to tell her that strength was just exhaustion wearing makeup, but instead I smoothed down the black dress I had bought yesterday with my credit card. A small act of faith that today would change everything. The dress cost more than I usually spent on clothes in 6 months, but it felt like armor I needed for what was coming. The Morrison Gallery had transformed for the auction. Rows of velvet chairs faced a raised platform where Eleanor would conduct the sale. My vase sat on a pedestal beside the podium, spotlit like a performer waiting for their cue. The chrysanthemums seemed to pulse with life under the lights, and I had to remind myself that this was real, that the piece I had pulled from garbage was about to be sold to the highest bidder. My mother gripped my hand as we took seats in the back row. Her fingers were warm and steady, anchoring me as the room filled with people whose jewelry probably cost more than my annual salary. Women in understated designer clothes that whispered rather than shouted their price tags. Men in suits that fit like second skins. And scattered throughout, journalists with notebooks and photographers adjusting their lenses. Eleanor took the podium with the confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times. She spoke about my vase with reverence, describing the technical mastery of the glazing, the emotional resonance of flowers captured in the moment between bloom and decay. Then she told the story, carefully, diplomatically, but with enough detail that everyone understood. This piece had been thrown away by someone who failed to recognize its value. It had been rescued, cleaned of garbage, and brought to her by an artist who refused to let dismissal be the final word. We'll open bidding at $170,000, Eleanor announced. A paddle rose immediately from the second row. Then another from the fifth. The numbers climbed with dizzying speed. 175, 180, 185. My mother's grip on my hand tightened with each increase. At 190,000, a woman in the third row raised her paddle with particular determination. She was perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair and a face that suggested she had fought battles and won them. Her eyes never left my vase as she continued bidding against 2 other collectors. 200,000, Eleanor announced as her paddle rose again. 205,000. 210,000. At 220,000, someone else entered the bidding, and the gray-haired woman's shoulders sagged slightly as she was outbid. During the brief break, Eleanor called to allow serious bidders to consider their limits. The woman found me in the back row. I wanted you to know, she said, her voice thick with emotion, seeing your piece in that window saved me. She sat down in the empty chair beside me, uninvited but welcome. I'm going through a divorce. 23 years of marriage and my husband keeps telling the lawyers that my nonprofit work is just an expensive hobby. That the shelter I built from nothing that houses 40 women a night is just something I do to fill time. Her eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide. When I read about your vase, about how it went from trash to treasure, I finally understood. The value was always there. It didn't need his recognition to exist. That night, I filed the papers I'd been too scared to submit. She squeezed my hand once, firmly, then returned to her seat as Eleanor called the room back to order. The bidding resumed with fresh intensity. 2 new bidders had entered during the break, driving the price past $220,000, then $230,000. The winning bid came from a woman in the front row who had waited until the very end to raise her paddle. $237,000, Eleanor announced, and the room erupted in applause as the hammer fell. The buyer was Judith Hartley, a Houston oil heiress known for her collection of feminist art. She approached me after the sale with tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face, gripping my hands with surprising strength. 3 marriages, she said without preamble. 3 men who told me my interests were hobbies. My first husband said my paintings were craft projects. My second said my poetry was self-indulgent. My third called my philanthropy a tax write-off with delusions of grandeur. She pulled me into an embrace that smelled of expensive perfume and determination. I've spent 20 years collecting art by women who were told they weren't real artists. Your vase isn't just ceramic and glaze. It's a monument to every woman whose worth went unrecognized, whose contributions were dismissed, whose love was treated as worthless. Judith released me but kept hold of my hands. This piece will be the centerpiece of my collection. And every time someone asks about it, I'll tell them exactly where it came from. The trash can of a man too blind to see treasure. Eleanor handled the press with practiced expertise, ensuring every reporter understood the piece's journey from garbage to a nearly $250,000 sale. Dylan's name was never mentioned directly, professional courtesy preventing that level of exposure, but everyone in our social circle would know. The story was too specific, too unique to be anyone else. My phone buzzed with a message from Margaret, my pottery student. A photo of her standing in the Metropolitan Museum beside one of her needlework pieces, recently acquired from her late husband's estate. He said my work was silly, her message read. The museum paid $2 million for silly. Just saw the news about your auction. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Creating treasures for men who couldn't see past their own limitations. I showed the message to my mother, who read it twice before speaking. Your grandmother would have loved this, she said softly. She died believing her paintings were worthless because that's what she was told. But you proved that the truth eventually surfaces. Catherine from the gallery approached with paperwork and a check that would change everything. Not just financially but fundamentally. After the gallery's commission, I would receive enough to start over, to never again stay in a relationship because I couldn't afford to leave, to never again accept someone else's assessment of my value. The rain had stopped by the time we left the gallery. Sun broke through the clouds, turning the wet streets into mirrors that reflected the city back at itself. My mother linked her arm through mine as we walked, and for the first time in years I didn't feel like I was drowning. The check cleared on a Thursday morning, and by Friday afternoon, I stood in the center of a sun-filled studio space in Brooklyn, keys heavy in my hand. The realtor had already left, and I was alone with 2,000 square feet of possibility. Windows stretched from floor to ceiling along the entire east wall, flooding the space with the kind of natural light I had only dreamed about in our cramped Manhattan apartment. The concrete floors were splattered with paint from the previous tenant, an abstract painter who had moved to Paris. I saw those stains not as flaws but as evidence that art had lived here before and would live here again. The moving truck arrived with my few possessions, looking almost embarrassed by the vastness of the space. My pottery wheel, rescued from the community center's storage closet where I had been keeping it, took its place near the windows. The work table Dylan had always complained about, saying it cluttered our dining area, finally had room to breathe. I arranged my tools on the industrial shelving units I had bought that morning, each item finding its proper place for the first time in years. Within a week, the commission requests overwhelmed my inbox. Catherine from Morrison Gallery forwarded them with barely contained excitement. A tech executive in San Francisco wanted a series of bowls that captured the stages of grief. A hotel chain inquired about custom pieces for their luxury properties. A museum in Boston asked if I would consider teaching a masterclass. The subject line that made me laugh out loud came from someone who identified herself only as a fellow survivor. I need something beautiful that was born from garbage. Name your price. I hired an assistant named Marcus, a recent art school graduate who approached pottery with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. He handled the business side of things, scheduling, supplies, correspondence, while I focused on creating. The irony of needing help to manage what Dylan had dismissed as my little hobby was not lost on either of us. 3 weeks into my new life, Amelia appeared in my doorway on a Saturday afternoon. She stood there holding a shopping bag, her posture uncertain, like she needed permission to enter this space that represented my life without her and her father. The designer jacket was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she wore jeans and an old sweater I remembered buying her 2 years ago. Mom. Her voice was smaller than I had heard it in months. Can I come in? I set down the bowl I had been glazing and really looked at my daughter for the first time since the anniversary disaster. She seemed diminished somehow, like she had been carrying weight that finally proved too heavy. I nodded and she entered slowly, taking in the space with wide eyes. This is incredible, she said, walking to the windows where afternoon light turned her hair golden. You did all this? The auction did this, I corrected but gently. She turned to face me and I saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Dad and Hazel fight all the time now. She keeps telling him he has no eye for value, that he wouldn't recognize quality if it bit him. She brings up your vase in every argument. Amelia sat down on the stool beside my wheel, the shopping bag in her lap. Last week, Dad tried to get his Rolex serviced. The one Hazel gave him. The store told him it was fake. Really good fake but fake. He came home and they had this massive fight. She admitted she bought it online from some guy who sells replicas. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. The woman who preached about real value, who owned a gallery, who had convinced Dylan that my authentic work was worthless, had given him a counterfeit gift. I wanted to feel vindicated, but mostly I felt sad for all of us caught in this web of perceived versus actual worth. I brought you something, Amelia said, pulling the designer jacket from her bag. I want to return it. All of it. The clothes, the jewelry, everything she bought me. It feels wrong now, like I was being bought. She folded the jacket carefully and set it aside, then looked at me with eyes that reminded me of the little girl who used to help me paint birthday cards at our kitchen table. Can you teach me? Pottery, I mean. I want to learn to make something real. The Times feature appeared that Sunday with a full-page spread in the art section. The headline read, "From Trash to Treasure. When Divorce Becomes Art," accompanied by a photo Catherine had taken of me at my new wheel. My hands were covered in clay, my expression focused but peaceful, and the light from those windows made everything glow. The article told my story without mentioning Dylan by name, but included enough detail that anyone who knew us would understand. Dylan's law firm, according to Amelia, had strongly suggested he take a leave of absence until the media attention subsided. Hazel's gallery had seen a 40% drop in foot traffic, with several artists requesting their work be returned. The art world, it seemed, did not appreciate someone who failed to recognize valuable work, especially when that someone claimed expertise. I positioned Amelia at the wheel, placing her hands on the clay exactly as my teacher had positioned mine years ago. The first thing to learn is centering, I told her. Everything depends on finding the center. She struggled at first, the clay wobbling and threatening to fly off the wheel. But gradually, with patience I did not know she possessed, she found the rhythm. The clay smoothed under her palms, rising and falling with her breath. Your vase was beautiful, she said quietly, eyes fixed on the spinning clay. I knew it that night. I wanted to be part of their world so badly. The gallery openings, the expensive things, the feeling of being sophisticated. I thought that was what success looked like. What does it look like now? I asked. She glanced around the studio at the afternoon light painting gold stripes across the concrete floor, at the shelves holding my new work, at the space I had claimed as entirely my own. Like this, she said simply. It looks like this. I guided her hands as the clay began to take shape, a simple bowl emerging from formlessness. Apologies are like glazes, I told her, remembering something my grandmother used to say. They work best when applied with genuine intention and proper timing. Is mine? She asked, vulnerable in a way that made my chest ache. Is my timing right? I touched her shoulder gently, feeling the tension she had been carrying begin to ease. Your timing, I said, watching her hands find their own rhythm on the clay, is perfect. The clay had dried on Amelia's first bowl, and we sat together in comfortable silence as I showed her how to prepare it for the kiln. 6 months had passed since that afternoon when she first asked me to teach her, and the change in both of us felt profound. The studio had become our sanctuary, a place where we rebuilt not just our relationship but ourselves. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, Eleanor's elegant handwriting on cream cardstock. Your solo exhibition, she had written. 23 pieces. Let's show the world what rising from ashes looks like. I read it 3 times before the words felt real. My own exhibition at Morrison Gallery, the same space where my vase had sold for more than I had ever imagined possible. The months of preparation passed in a blur of creation. Each piece explored a different aspect of dismissal and recognition, value and worth. A series of plates that appeared broken until you looked closer and saw how the cracks formed patterns of flowers. Bowls that seemed to contain storms, glazed in colors that shifted from despair to hope depending on the angle of view. And at the center of it all, on loan from Judith Hartley's collection and now insured for $500,000, the chrysanthemum vase that had started everything. Opening night arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made New York feel like a movie set. Amelia stood beside me at the gallery entrance, wearing a simple navy dress she had bought with money from her part-time job at a local bookstore. 3 weeks earlier she had returned everything Hazel had given her, packaging each item carefully with a note that said simply, I prefer things with authentic value. You ready for this? She asked, squeezing my hand as the first guests began arriving. No, I admitted, watching as the gallery filled with collectors, critics, journalists and curious observers. But I've learned that ready is overrated. My mother had flown in again from Florida, this time bringing my sister whom I had not seen in 2 years. They stood near the window display, my mother explaining to anyone who would listen that she had always known I would succeed, conveniently forgetting the years of suggesting I find a more stable career. But I did not mind the revision. She was here and that mattered more than accuracy. Eleanor commanded the room's attention for the opening toast, her champagne glass catching the light as she raised it high. 6 months ago, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed space. A woman walked into this gallery with a vase wrapped in a scarf. That vase had been thrown in the garbage by someone who could not recognize its value. Tonight we celebrate not just the art, but the artist who proved that one person's trash is sometimes a masterpiece waiting for the right eyes to see it. The crowd murmured its agreement, glasses raising in response. Stella Brennan's work reminds us that we should all learn to recognize value when it stands before us, Eleanor continued. Especially when it comes bearing gifts of the heart. Too often we dismiss what is made with love in favor of what comes with a price tag. Her journey from that garbage can to this gallery is a testament to the power of believing in your own worth, even when no one else does. The applause that followed felt physical, washing over me with the warmth I remembered from my kills. My mother's hand found my shoulder, squeezing with the kind of pride that needed no words, that transcended the years of misunderstanding between us. That is when I saw him. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, across the street in the shadow of a closed storefront, Dylan stood alone. He wore one of his expensive suits, the real Rolex glinting on his wrist under the streetlight. His face carried an expression I had never seen during our marriage, genuine recognition of loss. Not the petulant frustration of being wrong, but the deeper understanding of having discarded something irreplaceable. For a moment, our eyes met through the glass and the crowd and the years of accumulated hurt. I waited for the surge of satisfaction, for the vindictive pleasure of seeing him witness my success. But it never came. Instead, I felt something lighter, cleaner. I offered him the smallest nod, not forgiveness, not invitation, just acknowledgement that he had played his part in bringing me here. Then I turned back to my world, to the people celebrating my work, to the life I had built from the rubble of what he had destroyed. Marcus appeared at my elbow, tablet in hand, barely containing his excitement. 3 pieces sold in the first 20 minutes, he whispered. The storm bowls went to a collector from Chicago. She said they perfectly captured her divorce. By the end of the evening, the exhibition had sold out completely. 23 pieces finding new homes with people who understood their value, who saw beauty in the cracks and strength in the imperfections. Commission requests filled my inbox faster than Marcus could document them, bookings extending through the next year and beyond. As the crowd began to thin, Judith Hartley approached with tears in her eyes. She stood before the chrysanthemum vase, her hand pressed to the glass case that protected it. "Every time I look at this piece," she said softly, "I remember that value exists whether others acknowledge it or not. You've given so many of us permission to stop waiting for recognition and start recognizing ourselves." Amelia appeared beside me as the photographers gathered for final shots. She had spent the evening talking to visitors about the work, explaining techniques I had taught her, her enthusiasm genuine and infectious. As the cameras flashed, she leaned close and whispered, "I'm proud to be your daughter." The words landed in my chest with the weight of everything we had traveled through to reach this moment. The laughter at my anniversary gift. The choosing of sides. The months of silence. And now this, standing together in a gallery filled with my work, her hand in mine, both of us understanding what it meant to create something real. Later, as the gallery emptied and the lights dimmed to their after-hours glow, I stood alone with my pieces one final time. Each one had started as raw clay, shapeless and without worth until touched by intention and fire. The metaphor was not subtle, but then again the best truths rarely are. I thought about that night 12 months ago, standing in my kitchen in a discount dress, watching my marriage end with the thud of ceramic hitting garbage. If someone had told me then that the vase would sell for nearly $250,000, that I would have my own exhibition, that my daughter would return to me with genuine love instead of obligation, I would have thought them delusional. But here I stood, surrounded by proof that sometimes the garbage can is not an ending but a beginning. That sometimes dismissal is just redirection toward people who can actually see you. That sometimes the price tag, whether it is $237,000 or any other number, matters far less than the moment you finally understand your own worth. If this story of transformation and triumph had you cheering for Stella's victory, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Eleanor cleared the Fifth Avenue window display for a vase pulled from the trash, knowing exactly what recognition was coming. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more inspiring stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.